"You're not worth investing in," my father said, sliding the folder across the table like it was already decided, like I wasn't even part of the equation. I remember the exact weight of that moment, the quiet hum of the air conditioner, the way my mother didn't look up from her phone, the way my brother Jason leaned back in his chair with that easy confidence, like the world had always been built for him. That was the day they transferred $700,000 into his account. That was the day they chose him. And what they didn't know, what none of them knew sitting in that bright kitchen with polished marble counters and matching chairs, was that years later, in a room filled with bankers and legal advisors, that same decision would come back to them in a way they could never have predicted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how it actually started, because this wasn't one decision. It was a pattern. It was always a pattern. Growing up in the Carter house meant understanding one simple rule: Jason was the investment, and I was the expense. They never said it like that, not directly, but they didn't have to. It was in everything. When Jason turned 16, he got a brand new SUV with a red ribbon on the hood, $72,000, fully loaded. When I turned 16 6 months later, I got a card with $50 inside and a quick, "We'll celebrate properly another time." We never did. At dinner, my father talked about Jason's potential, like it was a stock everyone should be buying into early. "He's got instincts," he'd say, pointing his fork like he was making a pitch. "He understands risk. That's rare." I would sit there quietly, cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces, waiting for my name to come up, waiting for any acknowledgement that I existed in the same house. It usually didn't. And when it did, it sounded different. "Emily's more practical," my mother would say, like that was the nicest thing she could manage. Practical. Safe. Replaceable. I didn't realize how deep it went until the summer I turned 22. Jason had just graduated with a business degree he barely worked for, and my parents decided it was time to launch him. That was the word they used. Launch. Like he was something valuable, something engineered to succeed. I remember the meeting like it was yesterday. My father called us both into the kitchen, papers spread out across the counter, numbers, projections, a full plan. Jason stood there, energized, already talking about expansion and market positioning like he'd been doing it for years. I stood on the other side, holding my own folder, a much thinner one, filled with scholarship forms and a small proposal I'd spent months putting together. I had asked for $20,000. That was it. Not for a business. Not for something risky. Just to cover a certification program in financial analysis that I couldn't fully afford on my own. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had numbers. A timeline. A plan. I thought if I could just present it clearly enough, logically enough, they would see it. My father didn't even open my folder. He tapped it once with his finger and said, "We need to focus our resources where they'll generate real returns." Then he turned to Jason and slid over the documents that mattered. $700,000. I saw the number printed in bold, clean font, like it was normal, like it wasn't more money than I had ever imagined having in my entire life. My chest felt tight, but I didn't say anything at first. I waited. I thought maybe there would be a second part, maybe they would circle back to me. They didn't. "Dad," I finally said, my voice quieter than I expected, "I'm not asking for $700,000. I'm asking for 20. He sighed, like I was making this difficult. "Emily," he said, "this isn't about the amount. It's about the principle. Investment requires vision. Jason has that. He paused, choosing his words in a way that somehow made it worse. "You're steady. You'll figure something out." My mother nodded slightly, still not looking at me. Jason didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The decision had already been made long before that conversation started. That night, I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed staring at the numbers I had written down in my notebook. 20,000. That was all it would have taken for them to say they believed in me. Instead, they gave 700,000 to someone who had never had to prove anything. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me had already started to shift. I had spent years trying to earn something they had already decided not to give me. And for the first time, I realized I was playing the wrong game. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known sitting there in that quiet room with a notebook and a plan no one cared about, was that this moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Because while Jason was being handed $700,000 and told he was the future, I was about to step into a world where no one cared about family names or dinner table opinions. A world where numbers actually meant something. A world where, if you knew how to read them, you could build something no one could take away from you. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was this: I had been officially written off. And they were absolutely certain they had invested in the right child. They had no idea how wrong they were. I stopped asking them for anything after that day, not because I suddenly became stronger, but because I finally understood the rules they were playing by, and more importantly, the rules they were not saying out loud. In our house, value was not about effort or consistency, or even results. It was about perception. It was about who looked like a winner early. Jason had always looked like one. He spoke confidently, he took risks, he used big words at the dinner table that made my father nod in approval. I had numbers, plans, spreadsheets, quiet discipline. That did not impress anyone. So I adjusted. Not outwardly, not in a way they could see, but internally, in the way I approached everything from that point on. I took a second job that summer, working evenings at a small accounting firm 20 minutes from our house. It was not glamorous. I filed documents, entered data, organized client records. The office smelled like paper and coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everything feel slightly unreal. But it was the first place where numbers were treated like facts, not opinions. If something worked, it worked. If it did not, it did not. There was no favoritism in a balance sheet. No golden child in a profit and loss statement. My supervisor, a man named Daniel Reeves, barely noticed me the first few weeks. I was just another quiet employee in the background. But I watched everything. How he reviewed financial statements, how he questioned inconsistencies, how he traced small errors back to larger patterns. I stayed late when I could, not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to understand how the system actually worked. One night, around 9:30, he stopped by my desk and asked why I was still there. I told him I was trying to figure out why one of the client reports did not match the projected cash flow. He looked at the screen, then at me, and for the first time, really looked at me. He did not smile, but he nodded once and said, "Show me." That was the first real opportunity one had ever been given, and it did not come with encouragement or praise, just a simple expectation that I either understood what I was doing or I did not. I walked him through my reasoning, every step, every assumption, every number. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said, "You missed one variable," then pointed to a line item I had overlooked. But instead of dismissing me, he explained it calmly, directly, like it was worth explaining. That moment stayed with me. Because it was the opposite of everything I had experienced at home. There was no label. No dismissal. Just correction and forward movement. I started picking up more work after that. Small tasks at first, then more complex ones. I learned how to read financial structures the way other people read stories. I learned how money moved, how ownership was layered, how control was often hidden behind names that were never mentioned out loud. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, I became useful. Not in the way my parents defined usefulness, not in a way that came with attention or praise, but in a way that produced results. Meanwhile, at home, Jason's business was growing. That was the word my father used every time he talked about it. Growing. He would sit at the head of the table and describe new opportunities, new partnerships, expansion plans that always sounded impressive but never included actual numbers. When I asked once quietly what the current revenue looked like, the room went silent. For half a second too long. Jason laughed it off, said it was too early to focus on details like that. My father nodded, like that made sense. Vision first, he said. Numbers follow. I remember thinking how strange that sounded, but I did not argue. I had learned by then that logic did not change anything in that house. What I did not know at the time was that while Jason was spending that $700,000 building something that looked successful from the outside, I was building something much quieter, much smaller, but structured in a way that did not depend on anyone believing in me. I opened my first investment account with $500. It was not impressive. It was not even noticeable. But it was mine. Every week, I added what I could. $50. $100. Sometimes less. I tracked everything. Every gain, every loss, every decision. I made mistakes. A lot of them. But unlike at home, mistakes here did not define me. They taught me. And over time, something started to change. Not just in the numbers, but in the way I saw myself. I stopped waiting for permission. I stopped explaining my plans out loud. I stopped trying to prove anything to people who had already decided I was not worth the investment. Because somewhere between those late nights at the office and those quiet moments staring at spreadsheets, I realized something I had never understood before. Control was not given. It was built. Slowly. Quietly. And usually invisibly. And by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to take it away. But I did not know how far that would go. Not yet. And neither did they. I did not tell anyone when the numbers started to work, not Daniel, not my parents, not even myself out loud, because saying it would have made it feel fragile, like something that could be taken away if it was noticed too soon, so I kept everything contained in spreadsheets and quiet routines, checking balances before sunrise, reviewing positions during lunch breaks, adjusting small decisions at night when the rest of the house was asleep, and over time those small decisions began to stack in a way that was almost invisible at first, a few $100s turning into a few thousand, then plateauing, then dipping again when I made a wrong call. And I remember one specific week, when I lost nearly 8% of everything I had built and sat there staring at the screen thinking maybe my father had been right, maybe I did not have the instinct for this, maybe I was just forcing something that was never meant to work, but the difference was I did not have anyone else's voice in my head telling me to stop, only my own. And my own voice was quieter but more persistent. It did not say you are a failure, it said adjust. Review, try again. So I did, and slowly the pattern shifted again, steadier this time, more deliberate, less reactive, and that was when Daniel started giving me access to larger client files, not officially, not with a title change or a meeting, just a simple, take a look at this and tell me what you see. And I would go home with those documents printed out, spread across my desk, tracing ownership structures, identifying weak points, understanding how control was often separated from visibility, how the name on the surface was rarely the one actually making the decisions, and that idea stayed with me longer than anything else. Control does not need to be visible to be real. Around the same time Jason's updates at dinner started to change in tone, still confident, still full of energy, but less specific, more vague. He talked about future deals more than current performance, about potential partnerships that were in progress, about expansion plans that required additional capital, and I noticed the way my father listened, still supportive but asking more questions than before, subtle ones, careful ones, and Jason always had an answer, just not one that included numbers. We are positioning for long-term growth, he would say, or it is about market presence right now, and my father would nod, but slower than before, like something was not aligning the way it used to. One night he asked directly, "What is your current revenue this quarter?" And Jason paused. Just long enough for me to notice before saying, "We are reinvesting everything at this stage," which sounded impressive if you did not look too closely. My mother smiled and said that was smart, that it showed commitment, and the conversation moved on, but I could feel the shift in the room, small, almost unnoticeable but real, and I sat there quietly, the same way I always had, except this time I was not waiting for validation. I was observing a pattern I understood, overextension, lack of structure, dependence on perception rather than performance. I had seen it in client files, in failed portfolios, in companies that looked strong until the numbers were actually examined, and I wondered, just briefly, how long it would take before someone outside our family asked Jason the same questions my father had just started asking, and what would happen when he could not answer them. But I did not say anything, because it was not my place, not yet, and more importantly, I had my own structure to build, my own system to strengthen. I increased my contributions when I could, took on additional work, reinvested everything instead of pulling anything out, and for the first time I started thinking beyond just saving or growing. I started thinking about ownership, about how to structure assets in a way that allowed control without exposure. Daniel mentioned it once in passing, talking about a client who technically owned nothing in his own name but controlled multiple entities through layered agreements, and the way he explained it was simple, almost casual, but it changed the way I saw everything. That was when I opened my first limited liability entity, small, barely active at first, just a framework, a place to move things into instead of keeping them directly attached to me. It felt unnecessary at the time, almost excessive for the amount I had, but something about it made sense, like building a foundation before the structure was fully there, and I did it quietly, without announcement, without explanation, the same way I had done everything else. And looking back, that was the moment everything started to separate, not visibly, not in a way anyone around me could point to, but structurally, legally, strategically. I was no longer just an individual account trying to grow. I was building something that could expand beyond me, something that could scale, something that, if done correctly, would not depend on anyone's approval. And the strange part was, at home, nothing had changed at all. My parents still spoke about Jason like he was the future, still introduced him to friends as the one running his own company, still looked at me with that same quiet assumption that I would eventually settle into something stable and unremarkable, and I let them, because correcting them would have required explaining something they had never cared enough to understand, and because a part of me had started to realize something else entirely. The less they saw, the more room I had to build, and by the time they finally looked closely, I would not need them to see anything at all. The first time I realized something was actually wrong with Jason's business was not at the dinner table, not during one of his long explanations about future growth, but on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when my father called him while I was sitting in the living room and accidentally put the phone on speaker for just a second too long, just enough for me to hear Jason say, "I just need a little more time to stabilize things," before my father quickly turned the speaker off and walked into his office, closing the door behind him. But by then it was already clear, the tone was different, there was no confidence in it, no performance, just pressure. And I remember sitting there with my laptop open, a spreadsheet in front of me, and thinking how familiar that sounded, not because I had lived it, but because I had seen it in reports, in failing portfolios, in companies that had stretched themselves too far without a foundation strong enough to support it. And from that moment on I started paying closer attention, not to what Jason said, but to what he avoided saying, the way he skipped over details, the way he redirected conversations, the way he started using phrases like temporary setback and strategic pivot, words that sounded intelligent but did not actually explain anything. And at the same time my father's questions became more direct, less patient. "How much runway do you have left?" I heard him ask one evening, and Jason answered with something vague about upcoming deals, and my father did not push further, but he did not nod the same way he used to either. There was hesitation now, small, controlled, but present, and my mother, who had always supported Jason without question, started asking softer questions, ones that sounded supportive but carried concern underneath. "Are you getting enough help? Do you need to bring someone else in?" And Jason always said no. Always insisted he had it handled, but the more he said it, the less convincing it became. And through all of this I remained exactly where I had always been, on the outside of the conversation, invisible in the way that had once hurt but now felt like an advantage, because it meant no one was watching what I was doing, no one was asking about my numbers, no one was questioning my structure. And by that point my small account was no longer small, it had grown steadily, quietly, moving from thousands into six figures, and more importantly, it was no longer sitting in one place. I had diversified across different vehicles, structured through the entity I had created, reinvesting gains, minimizing exposure, building layers that were not obvious from the outside, and Daniel had started including me in more serious discussions at work, not as an assistant, but as someone whose analysis was expected to be accurate. And one afternoon he handed me a file and said, "Look at this and tell me where the risk actually is, not where they say it is." And I spent hours going through it, tracing ownership, identifying inconsistencies, and when I presented it back to him, he nodded once and said, "Good, now you are starting to see it," and that sentence stayed with me longer than anything else because it confirmed something I had been building toward without fully naming it. I was no longer just learning. I was understanding. And that understanding changed the way I saw everything at home because Jason's situation was no longer emotional to me, it was structural. I could see the gaps, the missing pieces, the lack of control hidden beneath the appearance of growth, and I knew, long before anyone said it out loud, that it was not sustainable, but what I did not know yet was how quickly it would start to affect everything else. The shift became undeniable a few weeks later when my parents canceled a weekend trip they had been planning for months, something they never did, and my father spent most of that Saturday in his office, door closed, taking calls that were shorter and sharper than usual, and that night at dinner the conversation was quieter, more restrained. Jason barely spoke, and when he did, it was to say he was working on a solution, that things were under control, and my father responded with a single sentence that changed the entire dynamic of the room: "Control is not what you say, it is what you can prove." And for a moment, no one said anything, not my mother, not Jason, and certainly not me, but I felt something settle in that silence, something final, because I had spent years being told I was not worth investing in, years being measured and dismissed without anyone ever asking what I could actually prove, and now, sitting at that same table, listening to that same voice question the one person they had chosen over me, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. This was not just about Jason anymore. This was about to become something else entirely, something bigger, something that would force them to look at numbers they had ignored, decisions they had made, and the one person in that house they had never considered as part of the equation, and the part that none of them could see yet, the part that I had been building quietly, carefully, layer by layer, was already in place, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be possible to ignore it. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, and I knew it was serious before I even answered because my father never called me during work hours, not unless something had already gone wrong, and when I picked up, there was a pause on the other end, not long, just a second or two, but enough for me to recognize something I had never heard in his voice before: uncertainty. "Emily," he said, and for a moment I thought he might say something normal, something casual, but instead he went straight to the point. "Do you still work with financial analysis?" And the question itself told me everything I needed to know, because this was not about curiosity, this was about necessity, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my tone even. "Yes," I said, "I do." Another pause, shorter this time, like he was recalibrating. "We might need someone to take a look at a situation," he added, carefully, like he was choosing each word to avoid saying too much, and I could picture him in his office, door closed, hand on his forehead, trying to frame the problem in a way that did not sound like a problem. "What kind of situation?" I asked, and he hesitated again, then said, "Jason's business is going through a temporary adjustment," and there it was, the same phrase Jason had been using at dinner, but coming from my father now, it sounded different, less confident, more contained. "What kind of adjustment?" I repeated, and this time the answer came out slower. "Cash flow is tighter than expected, and there are some obligations coming up." Obligations, not debts, not liabilities, obligations, and I almost said something, almost pointed out the difference, but I did not, because I had learned that people reveal more when they are not corrected. "And you want me to look at it," I said instead, and there was another silence, longer this time, like he was weighing something, pride against necessity, assumption against reality. "Just to review," he said finally, "give us an outside perspective." Outside, the word almost made me smile, because for years I had been treated as if I was not even part of the system, and now I was being invited in as an external resource, not a daughter, not a family member, but a function, and I said yes, not because I felt obligated, not because I wanted approval, but because I understood what this moment meant. This was not help, this was leverage. "Send me the documents," I said, and he agreed quickly, too quickly, like he had been hoping I would not ask questions, and within an hour, the files were in my inbox, multiple attachments, financial statements, projections, contracts, all labeled in a way that looked organized but felt rushed, and I closed my office door before opening them, not because I needed privacy, but because I needed focus. And as I went through the first set of numbers, the pattern became clear almost immediately: revenue inconsistent, expenses front-loaded, projections based on assumptions that had never materialized, and more importantly, control structures that were far weaker than they appeared on the surface. Jason's name was on everything, but the actual leverage points were tied to external agreements, short-term financing, conditional partnerships, the kind of structure that works only as long as momentum is maintained, and once that momentum slows, everything starts to tighten at the same time. and I felt that familiar sense of recognition, the same one I had felt reviewing failing portfolios at work, except this time it was not a client, it was my family, and I kept going, page after page, tracing obligations, mapping timelines, identifying where the pressure points would hit first, and by the time I finished, there was no question left. This was not a temporary adjustment, this was a structural problem, one that had been building for months, maybe longer, hidden behind confident language and selective reporting, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, not surprised, not emotional, just clear, and what struck me most was not how bad it was, but how predictable it had been. Every decision, every assumption, every missing safeguard, it all followed a pattern I had already learned to recognize, and for a moment I thought about that day in the kitchen, the $700,000, the folder I was not allowed to open, the sentence my father had used. We need to focus our resources where they will generate real returns, and I realized something that felt almost surreal. I was now the one holding the only accurate picture of their investment, and they did not even know how much I could see. And as I closed the last file, one thought settled in with complete certainty. They were not asking me to review this because they wanted insight, they were asking because they had already run out of options, and what they did not understand yet, what none of them understood yet, was that this was not just a review, this was the moment everything would begin to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone once it started. When I called my father back the next morning, I already knew exactly what I was going to say, not because I had rehearsed it, but because the numbers had made the decision for me, and numbers, unlike people, do not change based on emotion or expectation, they simply reflect what is already there. I reviewed everything, I said, keeping my tone steady, professional, the same way I spoke to clients at work, and there was a brief silence on the other end, like he was bracing himself for an answer he was not entirely sure he wanted to hear. And he prompted, and I could hear the tension behind that single word, the weight of everything he had invested, financially and emotionally, in Jason's success. It is not a short-term issue, I said, and I did not rush the explanation. I laid it out clearly, point by point, cash flow imbalance, over-leveraged commitments, dependency on projected revenue that had not materialized, structural weaknesses in ownership that limited flexibility. I did not raise my voice, I did not dramatize anything. I simply described what was already in the documents he had sent me, and the more I spoke, the quieter he became, until finally he interrupted, "So what are you saying?" And I paused for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this was the part that mattered. I am saying that without restructuring, the business will not sustain itself. Another silence, longer this time, and then, more quietly than I had ever heard him, "Can it be fixed?" And that question changed everything, because it was no longer about defending Jason, no longer about maintaining an image, it was about survival, and I answered honestly, parts of it can be stabilized, but not the way it is currently structured. I did not add anything else, I did not soften it, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might push back, might defend the decisions that had led here, but he did not. Instead he said something I had never heard him say to me before: "What would you do?" And the question itself felt unfamiliar, not because it was complicated, but because it implied something he had never offered me before: consideration, and I leaned back slightly, letting that settle for just a second before responding. "I would need full visibility," I said, "not just the documents you sent, everything, contracts, liabilities, timelines, and I would need authority to make adjustments where necessary." The words were deliberate, controlled, and there was no hesitation in them, and on the other end of the line, I could feel him processing that, not just the request, but what it meant. Because authority was not something he gave lightly, not even to Jason, not really, and especially not to me. "This is not something you can just review from the outside," I continued. "If you want it stabilized, it has to be restructured from within." Another pause, and then he said, "I will talk to your mother," which told me everything I needed to know about where he stood, because he was not saying no, he was preparing to say yes, but needed to align it first, and I ended the call without pushing further, because I had learned that pressure at the wrong moment can close doors that are already starting to open, and the rest of that day felt different. Not externally, nothing around me had changed, but internally, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, the dynamic I had grown up in was no longer fixed, it was moving, adjusting, responding to something I had built without their awareness. And later that evening, my mother called, which almost never happened unless it was coordinated, and her tone was softer than usual, more careful. "Your father said you had some ideas," she began, and I could hear the concern beneath her words, not just about the business, but about what it meant for Jason, for the image they had built around him. I have an assessment, I said, choosing my words deliberately, and a potential path forward, but it depends on whether you are willing to make changes, and she was quiet for a moment, then asked, what kind of changes, and I answered simply, control, structure, and transparency. I did not explain further, not yet, because I knew that if I said too much too early, they would react emotionally instead of strategically, and she exhaled slowly. Jason will not like that, she said, almost to herself, and I replied, this is not about what he likes. And there was another pause, heavier this time, because that was the first time I had ever spoken about Jason in a way that did not place him at the center, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, just slightly. We need to fix this, she said, and I nodded, even though she could not see me. Then we do it properly, I answered, and when the call ended, I sat there for a moment, not thinking about Jason, not thinking about my parents, but about the structure I had built, the layers, the control points, the systems that had allowed me to understand something they were only now beginning to see. And I realized that this was no longer just about analyzing a failing business. This was about stepping into a position I had never been given, not by request, not by permission, but by necessity. And once that step was taken, there would be no returning to the version of me they had always assumed I would be. The meeting was set for Monday morning at 9, and I knew it was not going to be a normal family conversation the moment I walked into my father's office and saw that it had been arranged like a formal review, not a discussion, documents printed, folders aligned, my father seated at the head of the table instead of behind his desk, my mother to his right, and Jason already there, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. A posture that tried to signal control but felt more like resistance. And for a second, just a second, I saw the version of this scene that would have played out years ago, me standing quietly, waiting to be dismissed, waiting for someone else to define the outcome, but that version no longer existed, not because I had changed outwardly, but because the structure had changed, the numbers had changed, and more importantly, the position I was stepping into had already been established before I even walked into the room. Let us make this quick, Jason said as I took my seat, his tone sharp, impatient. I already explained the situation, and I did not respond to him immediately, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood something he did not yet realize. This was no longer his meeting to control. I reviewed everything, I said instead, addressing my father, not Jason, and that small choice shifted the room more than any argument could have, because it clarified alignment, it showed where the decision point actually was. And my father nodded once, signaling for me to continue. The current structure is not sustainable, I said, the same way I had on the phone, calm, direct, without emphasis, and Jason exhaled sharply, leaning forward. That is not accurate, he said, you are looking at this too narrowly. This is a growth phase, not a stability phase. And I turned to him then, finally meeting his eyes, not with frustration, not with defensiveness, but with something he was not expecting, neutrality. Growth without control is not growth, I said, it is exposure. And he opened his mouth to respond, but my father spoke first. Let her finish, and that sentence, simple as it was, landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it established authority in a way that had never been given to me before. And I continued, outlining the issues one by one, not as criticisms, but as facts: cash flow imbalance, dependency on projected deals that had not closed, obligations tied to timelines that could not be adjusted under the current agreements. And as I spoke, I could see the shift happening, not in Jason, who remained defensive, but in my parents, who were hearing the situation framed in a way that could not be dismissed as opinion, because it was not opinion, it was structure. And when I finished, there was a brief silence, and then my father asked the only question that mattered, what needs to change? And I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because this was the point where the conversation would move from analysis to decision, and decisions, unlike analysis, carry consequences. Control, I said finally, the current structure disperses control across multiple external agreements, that needs to be consolidated. Jason shook his head immediately. That is not how this works, he said, his voice rising slightly. You cannot just take control of something that is already in motion. And I looked at him again, the same calm, steady focus. Then it will continue in the direction it is already going, I said, and I did not need to explain what that direction was, because by now, everyone in the room understood it. And my mother shifted slightly in her seat, her hands tightening together. What else? She asked, her voice quieter than usual. Transparency, I said, full visibility on all obligations, timelines and dependencies, not summaries, not projections, actual data. Jason let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. You are talking like this is a corporation, he said. This is a startup, and I did not raise my voice when I answered, "The numbers do not change based on what you call it," and for a moment, the room went completely still, because that was not just a statement about the business, it was a statement about everything that had led to this point, the assumptions, the labels, the way decisions had been made based on perception instead of reality. And my father leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, then asked the final question, the one that would determine everything that came next. "And if we do this," he said slowly, "what happens?" And I met his gaze directly, without hesitation. "You stabilize what can be stabilized," I said, "and you prevent further loss." I did not promise recovery. I did not promise success, because those were not guarantees anyone could make at this stage, and that honesty mattered more than anything else I could have said. And as the silence settled again, heavier this time, more deliberate, I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge until that moment. This was not just a meeting about Jason's business, this was the moment where the entire dynamic of our family was being restructured, not emotionally, not verbally, but functionally, and once that shift was accepted, even partially, there would be no going back to the way things had been before. Jason stood up before anyone else could speak, the chair scraping slightly against the floor, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence that had settled after my last sentence, and for a moment he just looked at our father, not at me, like I was not even part of the equation, like this was still a conversation he could redirect if he chose the right angle. "So that is it," he said, his voice controlled but tight. "We are just going to hand everything over," because she read a few documents and I did not react, not outwardly, because this was expected. Resistance always comes before recognition, especially when control is involved, and my father did not respond immediately either, which was more telling than anything he could have said, because if this had happened a year ago, he would have defended Jason without hesitation, would have shut down the conversation before it reached this point. But now he was quiet, considering, weighing something that had never been questioned before. And my mother shifted slightly, her gaze moving between both of us, uncertainty written in the small movements of her hands. "No one is handing anything over," she said carefully, as if trying to maintain balance in a situation that was already tilting. "We are discussing options," but Jason shook his head, a short, sharp motion. "No, we are not," he said, "we are letting her dismantle everything I built," and that was the first time he said it directly, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as an accusation. And for a second, I almost answered emotionally, almost pointed out the difference between building something and maintaining it, almost reminded him of the numbers, the timelines, the obligations that were already closing in, but I did not, because I understood something he did not. This was not a debate that could be won with words, this was a structure that would either hold or collapse regardless of how it was described. "No one is dismantling anything," I said instead, my voice even, steady. "I am identifying what is already unstable," and he laughed, but it was not the kind of laugh that comes from humor. It was short, sharp, defensive. "You have always done that," he said, finally looking directly at me. "You sit there, analyzing everything, acting like you understand how the real world works, but you have never actually built anything." And for a moment, the room went completely still again, because that statement, more than anything else, reflected the way they had all seen me for years, the quiet one, the observer, the one who understood theory but not execution, and I felt that familiar weight of it, not new, not surprising, but still present. And I could have responded, could have listed everything I had done, everything I had built quietly without their knowledge, but I did not, because proving something too early removes its impact later. And instead I turned back to my father, not dismissing Jason, but repositioning the conversation where it actually mattered. "This is not about perception," I said, "it is about timing." And my father leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on me now. "Explain that," he said, and I nodded once. "There are obligations coming due within the next 90 days, I said. "If nothing changes, those obligations will force decisions that cannot be controlled, not by Jason, not by you." I paused just long enough for that to settle, then continued, "Right now, you still have the ability to restructure before those points are reached, but that window is closing." And this time, no one interrupted, not Jason, not my mother, because this was no longer theoretical, it was specific, measurable, tied to a timeline that could not be ignored. And my father exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Jason before returning to me. "And if we do nothing?" he asked, and I answered without hesitation, "Then the structure decides for you." And that sentence landed differently than the others, because it removed the illusion of control entirely. It made it clear that an action was not neutral, it was a decision with consequences. And for the first time since the meeting started, Jason did not respond immediately. He sat there, still tense, still resistant, but quieter now, processing something he had not allowed himself to fully consider before. and my mother looked down at the documents in front of her, not reading them, just seeing them differently, like they were no longer abstract numbers but something more immediate, more real, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was active, heavy with the weight of a decision that had not yet been made but could no longer be avoided, and as I sat there, watching all of this unfold, I realized something that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. This was the moment where everything shifted from assumption to reality, where the roles we had all been playing without question were being tested against something that could not be ignored or explained away, and the part that none of them fully understood yet, the part that had been building quietly beneath all of this, was that once they chose to act, once they agreed to change the structure even slightly, they would be stepping into a system that I already understood far better than they realized, and from that point on, the balance would never return to what it had been before. My father was the one who finally broke the silence, not with a statement, not with a defense, but with a question that sounded smaller than anything he had said before. "What do you need from us?" And that was the moment I knew the decision had already been made, not officially, not out loud, but internally, because that question does not come from someone who is still deciding whether to act. It comes from someone who has accepted that action is necessary, and is now trying to understand the cost. And I did not answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that whatever I said next would define the structure going forward, not just for the business, but for everything connected to it. Access, I said finally, full access to all accounts, agreements, and communication with any external partners. I kept my voice even, measured, the same tone I had used from the beginning, and my father nodded slowly, like he had expected that, but my mother hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Jason for just a second before returning to me. "That is a lot," she said quietly, and I met her gaze without shifting. "So is the situation," I replied, and she did not argue after that, because by now, the weight of the numbers had started to replace the comfort of assumption, and my father leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, and after that he asked, and I continued, "We consolidate control where possible, renegotiate obligations that can be adjusted, and isolate anything that cannot be stabilized." I did not soften the language, did not frame it in a way that made it sound easier than it was, because clarity mattered more than comfort at this point, and Jason let out a slow breath, not sharp this time, not reactive, but controlled, like he was trying to recalibrate his position within a structure that was no longer centered around him. "And where do I fit into all of that?" he asked, his voice lower now, less defensive, more uncertain, and for the first time, I turned to him fully, not as an opponent, not as a distraction, but as part of the system that needed to be addressed. "That depends on how you want to approach this," I said. "You can either be involved in the restructuring process, which means adapting to changes you may not agree with, or you can step back while it is stabilized." And he stared at me for a moment, searching for something, maybe an opening, maybe a way to push back, but there was none, because this was not about winning or losing anymore, it was about function, and function does not negotiate with preference. "So I either give up control or watch everything fall apart," he said, and I did not respond immediately, not because I disagreed, but because the way he framed it was still based on the assumption that he had control to begin with, and after a second, I said, "You decide how you participate, but the structure will move either way," and that was the first time I said it that directly, without adjusting it for tone or impact, and it landed differently, not just on him, but on my parents as well, because it made something clear that had not been said out loud before. This was no longer dependent on agreement, it was dependent on necessity, and my father leaned back slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show that he understood the implication. "If we move forward with this," he said slowly, "you are in charge of the process," and that sentence, more than anything else, shifted the entire room, not because it was unexpected, but because it made the transition official, from observation to authority, from analysis to execution, and I nodded once, not out of acceptance, but out of acknowledgement, because this was not something I needed to be convinced of. It was something I had already prepared for long before this conversation ever happened, and my mother looked at me differently then, not with doubt, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, like she was seeing a version of me that had been there all along but had never been considered relevant until now. And Jason sat back in his chair, quieter than I had ever seen him, not defeated, not yet, but no longer certain, and as the meeting moved into specifics, timelines, next steps, documentation, I could feel the shift continuing, not in words but in alignment, in the way decisions were being routed, in the way questions were being directed, and for the first time, I was not outside of that process. I was at the center of it, not because I had asked to be, not because I had been given a chance, but because the structure required it, and as I gathered the documents at the end of the meeting, organizing them into a system that made sense to me, I realized something that felt almost distant, like a memory from a different version of my life. There had been a time when I would have done anything to be included in a conversation like this, to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen, but now, standing there with control shifting quietly into my hands, I understood something far more important than being chosen. I understood what it meant to be necessary, and once you become necessary in a system that is already under pressure, everything else follows whether anyone is ready for it or not. The first thing I did after that meeting was not call anyone, not celebrate, not even pause to process what had just shifted. I went straight back to my office, closed the door, and opened every file again from the beginning, because stepping into control without rechecking the structure is how mistakes happen, and mistakes at this level do not stay small, they compound. So I rebuilt everything from the ground up, every account, every obligation, every timeline mapped out in a way that removed interpretation and replaced it with sequence, and the more I worked through it, the clearer the pattern became. There were 3 immediate pressure points, not 1, not 2, but 3, all converging within the same 90-day window: vendor payments tied to contracts that could not be delayed without penalty, short-term financing agreements that required performance thresholds Jason's business had not met, and a partnership clause that allowed an external party to withdraw support if certain milestones were not reached, and each of these on their own could have been managed, adjusted, negotiated, but together they created something far more dangerous, a cascade, the kind where one missed obligation triggers another, until control is no longer an option, only reaction. And I sat there staring at the timeline I had built, each date aligned, each dependency marked, and I realized something that made everything else irrelevant. We were not working with months, we were working with weeks, and that changed the entire approach, because restructuring is not just about what you change, it is about when you change it, and timing at this stage was everything. I called my father first, not to explain everything, but to set the expectation. We need to move faster than you think, I said, and there was no hesitation in his response this time, no attempt to minimize the situation. What do you need? He asked, and I listed it clearly: immediate access to all accounts, authorization to communicate directly with external partners, and confirmation that any decision I made within the scope of restructuring would be supported without delay. And he agreed, not cautiously, not conditionally, but directly, which told me that whatever resistance had existed before was no longer the primary factor. Urgency had replaced it, and within the next 48 hours, everything started to shift. Account access was transferred, documents that had been filtered or summarized before were now complete, raw, unedited, and for the first time I was seeing not just the structure, but the gaps between what had been presented and what actually existed. And those gaps were where the real risk had been hiding: obligations slightly larger than reported, timelines slightly shorter than assumed, dependencies more fragile than anyone had acknowledged, and none of it was catastrophic on its own, but together it created a system that had been operating on the edge without anyone fully recognizing it. And as I worked through each piece, prioritizing what needed to be addressed first, I reached out to the first external partner, a firm that had provided short-term financing based on projected revenue, and the conversation was exactly what I expected: cautious, direct, focused entirely on numbers, not promises, not explanations, just data. And for the first time in this entire process, I felt completely aligned with the conversation, because this was the environment I understood: not family dynamics, not perception, just structure. And I laid out the situation clearly, not defensively, not emotionally, but precisely, identifying where adjustments could be made, where timelines could be renegotiated, and what conditions would need to be met to maintain their involvement. And the response was not immediate agreement, but it was not rejection either. It was consideration, which at this stage was exactly what we needed: time, not much, but enough to prevent the first pressure point from triggering. And as I moved through the rest of the system, addressing each obligation in order of urgency, I could feel the structure beginning to stabilize, not fully, not yet, but enough to shift it away from immediate collapse and into controlled adjustment. And throughout all of this, Jason remained present but quieter, involved in conversations but no longer leading them, responding when asked, providing information when necessary, but no longer defining the direction. And I did not push him out. I did not diminish his role. I simply operated within the structure that now required a different kind of control, and the difference was not dramatic, not loud, but it was undeniable. And one evening, as I was reviewing the updated timeline, my mother came into The room, standing in the doorway for a moment before speaking, "It looks different," she said, and I glanced up briefly, then back at the screen. "It is," I replied, and she nodded slowly, taking that in, not fully understanding the details but recognizing the shift, and as she turned to leave, she paused for just a second and said something she had never said to me before: "I am glad you are handling this," and then she walked out, leaving me alone with the numbers, the structure, and the quiet realization that this was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about maintaining control over something that had already started to fall apart, and the only reason that control existed now was because I had built it long before anyone thought it would be needed. By the end of the second week, the situation had not magically improved. It had not transformed into something stable or predictable, but it had stopped getting worse, and that distinction mattered more than anything else at that stage, because in systems like this, stopping the downward momentum is the first real sign of control, and I could see it in the numbers, small adjustments beginning to hold, timelines shifting just enough to create breathing room, obligations no longer stacking on top of each other at the same rate, and while none of it was visible from the outside, inside the structure, it was significant. But what mattered even more was what was about to happen next, because stabilization is only the first phase. After that comes exposure, not public exposure, not dramatic but structural. The kind where everything that has been hidden behind assumptions starts to become visible to the people who need to see it, and that process had already begun. The first sign came during a call with one of the external partners, a senior advisor who had been working with Jason since the early stages of his business, someone who had always treated him as the primary decision maker, the one driving the direction. And as I walked him through the updated structure, the adjusted timelines, the revised obligations, there was a moment where he paused, not because he disagreed, but because he was recalibrating. "Who is leading this now?" he asked, and the question was simple, direct, but it carried more weight than anything else in that conversation, because it acknowledged a shift that had not been formally announced, and I answered without hesitation: "I am overseeing the restructuring process," and there was no challenge, no resistance, just a brief silence followed by a nod I could hear even through the phone. "Understood," he said, and from that point on, the tone of the conversation changed, not dramatically, but subtly, more direct, more precise, aligned with the way I had structured the discussion, and that was the first time I saw it happen outside of our family, the recognition of control not based on titles or history, but on clarity and execution. And when the call ended, I sat there for a moment, not reacting, not reflecting, just noting it, because this was not about validation, it was about function, and function had just shifted, and that shift continued to extend into every part of the system. More calls, more adjustments, more renegotiations, each one reinforcing the same pattern. The more structured the information, the more aligned the response, and slowly, without any announcement, the entire dynamic began to reorient itself around that structure, and Jason felt it, even if he did not say it out loud. I could see it in the way he approached conversations now, less declarative, more reactive, asking questions instead of making statements, looking for confirmation instead of assuming control. And one evening, after a long day of calls and revisions, he came into the room where I was working, not abruptly, not defensively, just standing there for a moment before speaking. "I did not realize it was this far off," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and I did not respond immediately, not because I did not hear him, but because I understood that this was not a statement that needed correction or explanation. It was recognition, and recognition takes time to process. "It was not obvious from the surface," I said finally, and he nodded slightly, looking down at the documents spread across the desk, the same kind of documents he had once dismissed as secondary to vision, and for a moment, neither of us said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The structure was already speaking for itself, and as he left the room, closing the door behind him quietly, I returned to the timeline, adjusting the next sequence of actions, because even though the immediate pressure had eased, the system was still fragile, still dependent on decisions that needed to be executed precisely. And that was when I saw it, not in the current data, but in the projection I had built based on the adjustments already made, a path that had not been possible before, not because the numbers had changed dramatically, but because the structure now supported a different kind of movement, one that did not rely on assumptions, but on controlled execution. And for the first time since this process began, I allowed myself to consider what that meant, not just for the business, but for everything connected to it, because once a system shifts from instability to controlled movement, it opens possibilities that were not visible before, and I realized something then that I had not fully acknowledged until that moment. This was no longer just about preventing loss, it was about redefining what the system could actually become under the right control, and the part that none of them had seen yet, the part that I had built long before any of this started, was already positioned to take that next step when the time came. The shift became visible the day the banker asked for a formal review meeting, not a casual call, not a quick update, but a structured session with documentation, projections, and authority present in the room, and that kind of request does not come from curiosity, it comes from recognition, because by that point the system was no longer reacting, it was moving with intent, and people who operate in that space can tell the difference immediately. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 in the morning, held at the firm's office downtown, a glass building that reflected everything around it but revealed very little from the outside, and as I walked in, I could feel the difference before anything was said, not tension, not resistance, but attention, the kind that comes when a situation is no longer being dismissed as temporary, and my father was already there, seated across from the banker and a legal advisor, both of them reviewing printed documents that I had prepared the night before, and Jason arrived a few minutes later, quieter than usual, his usual confidence replaced with something more measured, more aware, and I took my seat without introducing myself beyond what was necessary, because this was not about identity, it was about structure, and the banker began without small talk. "We have reviewed the updated projections," he said, his tone neutral but focused, "and we need clarification on the controlling position moving forward," and there it was, not hidden, not softened, the question that had been forming since the restructuring began. Who actually holds control? And for a moment, my father looked at me, not uncertain, but acknowledging, and I answered directly, "Control is being consolidated under a single structure to ensure consistency across obligations and timelines." I did not name it yet. I did not explain the full scope, because timing matters, and the legal advisor leaned forward slightly, "And that structure is currently under your direction," he said, not asking, but confirming, and I nodded once, yes. And from that point on, the conversation shifted entirely, no longer about whether the system could be stabilized, but how it would be managed moving forward, and I walked them through the adjustments, the renegotiated timelines, the isolation of unstable elements, each point supported by data, each decision tied to a measurable outcome, and as I spoke, I could see the alignment happening, not agreement in the emotional sense, but recognition in the structural sense, the kind that matters in rooms like this. And Jason remained quiet for most of it, not excluded, but no longer the focal point, responding when asked, providing clarification when necessary, but no longer defining the direction. And at one point, the banker turned to him and asked, "Are you comfortable with this restructuring?" And there was a brief pause, not long but enough to show that the answer was not automatic, and Jason glanced at me for just a second before responding. "It is necessary," he said. And that was the closest thing to acknowledgement he had given so far, not of me directly, but of the structure itself, and the meeting continued, moving through the final details, conditions, expectations, until eventually the legal advisor closed the folder in front of him and said, "Then we will proceed based on this framework," and just like that, it was no longer a plan, it was a formal structure, recognized, documented, and aligned with every external party involved, and as the meeting ended, my father stood, shaking hands with the banker, thanking him in a way that felt more grounded than anything I had heard from him before, not confident, not assured, but steady, and as we walked out of the building together, there was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, not forced, just present, and then he said something that would have meant everything to me years ago. "You handled that well, simple, direct, without elaboration," and I nodded once, not dismissing it, but not holding onto it either, because by now, I understood something I had not understood before. Validation that comes after necessity is not the same as belief that comes before it, and as we reached the parking lot, Jason stopped walking for a second, looking at the building behind us, then back at me. "I thought I had control," he said quietly, and I met his gaze, not correcting him, not reinforcing it, just acknowledging the reality that had already unfolded. "It looked like it," I said, and he nodded slightly, taking that in, and for the first time, there was no resistance in it, no defense, just understanding. And as we got into the car and drove away, I realized that the final shift had already happened, not in the meeting, not in the documents, but in the way each of them now saw the system, not as something defined by assumption or expectation, but as something that required structure, and the part that none of them had fully processed yet, the part that had been there long before any of this began, was that the structure they were now relying on had not been built in response to this situation, it had been built quietly, deliberately, long before they ever realized they would need it. The system did not change overnight, it did not suddenly become perfect or effortless, but it held, and that was the difference that mattered, because for the first time since everything began to unravel, nothing new was breaking, nothing unexpected was collapsing, and that kind of stability is quiet, almost invisible. But it carries a weight that is hard to explain unless you have watched something slowly fall apart, and then felt it stop, and in the weeks that followed, the structure continued to strengthen, obligations were met on adjusted timelines, partnerships stabilized under clearer terms, and what had once been a fragile network of assumptions became something defined by actual control. Not complete, not without risk, but real, and through all of this, the dynamic in our family shifted in ways that were not announced but deeply felt. My father no longer spoke in absolute confidence about future outcomes, instead he asked questions, measured ones, grounded in what could be proven. My mother listened more than she spoke, her certainty replaced with a kind of careful awareness, and Jason, who had once filled every space with plans and projections, became quieter, not diminished, but changed, more aware of the structure around him, more deliberate in what he said, and what he chose not to say. And as for me, nothing about my role felt new, because everything I was doing now had been built long before this moment. The only difference was that it was finally visible, and one evening, as we sat at the same dinner table where everything had once been decided without me, my father looked across at me and said, "We should have listened to you earlier," and there was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to reframe the past, just a simple acknowledgement, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering, "You did not need to, because the truth was, if they had listened earlier, I would not have built what I had built, I would not have learned what I had learned, and the system they now relied on would not exist." And he nodded slowly, understanding something in that response that did not need to be explained, and the conversation moved on, not back to old patterns, not to comparisons or assumptions, but to something quieter, more balanced. And as I sat there, I realized that the real shift had never been about control alone, it had been about perspective, about the difference between being seen and being understood, because for years, I had wanted to be seen by them, to be recognized, to be chosen, but what I learned instead was far more valuable. Being seen can be taken away, it depends on attention, on opinion, on timing, but being understood, even if it comes later, even if it comes through necessity, creates something more stable, something that does not disappear when the situation changes. And the deeper truth, the one that took the longest to understand, was that people do not always recognize value when it is quiet, when it does not demand attention, when it does not fit the shape they expect, and that does not make the value any less real, it just means it has to be built without waiting for approval. And when it is finally revealed, not through words but through results, it changes not only how others see you, but how they understand themselves. And in the end, this was never just a story about money or control, or who was right and who was wrong. It was about what happens when someone is overlooked, not because they lack ability, but because they do not fit a certain expectation, and how that person can either disappear into that assumption or build something strong enough to stand without it. And more importantly, it is about what happens when the people who made that assumption are given a second chance to see differently, to recognize not just what was built, but who built it, and to understand that value is not always loud, not always obvious, but when it is real, it does not need to be announced, it simply holds everything together when it matters most. And if there is anything to take from this, it is that we should look more carefully at the people around us, not just the ones who stand out, but the ones who quietly keep showing up, quietly building, quietly learning, because sometimes the person you overlook today is the one who will hold everything together tomorrow. And when that moment comes, what matters most is not just that they are capable, but that we are willing to see them for who they truly are.